is so here are some of the concepts from the very beginning of what will be a long semester. I think I emphasized to you the importance of really understanding Say's law, which is the notion that the act of producing an output produces enough income to buy up everything that was bought. And it is really that foundation in a closed economy that is really critical to understanding why we have national income and product accounts where the GDP is measured. And we pointed out that economics is never a zero-sum game, that there are winners and losers, and even those that you consider to be a winner on something can be a loser too. And I pointed out that lower interest rates makes a winner out of those who want to borrow. But those very same people may be savers, and they don't want low interest rates. They want high interest rates because they're savers. So we never have zero-sum games. What we want to do is be able to anticipate outcomes. But sometimes outcomes can be both unintended and unanticipated. So when we do forecasting, the really good forecasters try to think about every possible outcome that could happen and put a probability to them. And still in all, there'll be things that you never anticipated. Now, we know that there's always stuff that happens that's unintended. You know, when we reduce interest rates, we're not intending to hurt senior citizens who may be putting their money in savings accounts at banks. That's not the intention. So that's unintended. But where we get tripped up is when things become unanticipated. If we pass this stimulus package, there are going to be unanticipated consequences. We don't know what the savings rate will be on it. We don't know if money will flood into the stock market and create a stock market bubble. We don't know if people are going to get scared because the government is giving them money and they go, wow, things must be really bad if the government's giving me more money. And instead of spending more, they spend less and they hold on to the money. We don't know whether or not Congress is going to be forced next year or the year after to raise taxes to fund this stimulus package. This is what we're talking about. Now, when we speak about the economy and we speak about what the goals of the economy are, yes, we want stability and yes, we want fairness. But really the thing that drives policy is growth. We want the economy to get bigger because growth is synonymous with a better standard of living economically for people. And since the population always grows, we always need to have growth in the economy to compensate for that. Now, typically, that's where the most focus goes in terms of economic policy. And we'll spend a lot of time on fiscal and monetary and regulatory policy in this class. But we express that growth typically in terms of constant dollar GDP at an annual rate. We look at growth annualized. We say the economy grew, let's say, in the fourth quarter of 2020. And if it were to continue to grow at that rate for 4 quarters, for a year, how big would the economy be a year from now? What would be the cumulative growth? It's just basically a notion of compound growth. And you're saying to yourself, okay, if you took the same growth rate in the fourth quarter and you now had that growth rate for 4 quarters, what would be the growth rate? So to do that, you take the growth rate for the quarter and you take that growth rate and you raise it to the 4th power. It's cumulative, so you don't multiply by 4 because it's cumulative. So if the growth rate in the quarter were 2% and you went from 100 to 102, the growth rate for a year would not be 108, would not be 8%. It would be like 8.4 because you're doing 2% above 102. And then 2% above 104 point something. That's how you accumulate. That's what compounding does. But anybody who's in a macro class has to learn how to disaggregate. You have to look at the big number like GDP and break it up into sectors like households, businesses, governments, and the rest of the world to look at consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports. It's really beneath the surface that the story is told. And of course, when we deal with very large numbers, what we like to do is think in terms of growth, as I just said. But if you want a quick way of looking at growth to see if it has accelerated or not, take the logarithms of the numbers, which in your textbook he calls putting it on a ratio scale, not a ratio. I have an extra n there, so it's a ratio scale. Okay, those are the concepts we talked about in the first two classes. So in that context, I asked you a couple of questions. I asked you to go take a look at the minutes of the FOMC meeting from December and see what they talked about in terms of inflation. And indeed, what they talked about was still can't seem to get inflation up to our 2% target. They are targeting that. And the way they're targeting it, though, and what they discussed in that FOMC meeting is sort of an asymmetry, meaning they're going to try to let inflation run hot, meaning they want it to average over a long time period, 2%, but over a long time period so far, inflation has run at less than 2%, which means if they could get it above 2%, they'll let it run above 2%. So you had a long period where it was under 2%, then let's have a period where it runs consistently above 2%. You average the two together, and guess what you've got? 2% over a very long time period. That is their preference. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd appreciate it if you'd stop sending notes to each other. It's disruptive and it's rude and it's not necessary. Okay, thank you. So then I said, okay, this is how they're thinking about inflation. It's asymmetrical. They're going to let it run hot. Asymmetrical meaning they won't tolerate it below 2%. They'll try to keep pushing it above 2%. And if it gets above 2%, they'll let that run for a while. That's not symmetrical. That's not equal in terms of their thinking. Why would they want 2% inflation? Because they consider 2% inflation to be consistent with price stability. Price stability would not be no inflation, because if you had no inflation, you'd probably have a number of things that are running above zero. But on average, then you'd have to have a number of things that are running below zero, and they don't want deflation. So in order to get something considered to be price stability, you don't want any deflation, inflation below zero. It's okay to have some things running between 0 and 2 and other things running between 2 and something above 2 that averages to 2, but you don't want there to be deflation. And so if you aimed at 0% inflation, then by definition you have different parts of the economy deflating, going below 0, because on average you're at 0. Okay? So what kinds of data did they look at? Well, I think it's fairly obvious when you go through it. Obviously, they looked at GDP growth, inflation, employment data, unemployment data, industrial production. There's a whole range of different statistics that you would look at to try to give you a full impression of how the economy is performing. Some of them focus on inflation, others focus on growth, others focus on output, others focus on sales, retail sales, personal consumption expenditures, etc. Okay? How close do you believe that the U.S. economy is now to a return to a deep recession? How do your conclusions contrast with those of the Fed? Well, the Fed certainly doesn't see a recession coming at all. And frankly, the economy really isn't close to going into a deep recession. We've recovered. We fell like a rock during the period from March through roughly June, where the economy fell at a rate that was unprecedented. It was a sharp drop down. And we were, in fact, in a deep recession. But, you know, we smashed off the bottom of the economy and we came back up in sort of a V for the overall economy. The issue is that while the overall economy, as measured by GDP, bounced back that way, not every sector did. Certainly small services, retail, trade, parts of the labor market simply did not bounce back. And parts of the economy that are associated with relatively low-paying jobs, that didn't drop back at all. So a lot of people have said, yeah, you've got actually a K. Think of a vertical drop. You've got a piece that came up, and then you've got a piece coming down. And that piece coming down is really people who low-paid, primarily service jobs and service industries. But are we close to a deep recession? No. We've brought back a whole lot of people back to work. We're still 11 million people who've lost their jobs who have not gotten their jobs back. But the economy has sprung back. The financial markets are very strong. And anyone who has pension plans, pension funds, savings plans, anything that's been invested, including in real estate, doing just fine. And a lot of people in higher paying occupations, primarily people who could work from home, are doing just fine. Their paycheck is there. So it's not an economy that's been kind to everybody in its recovery, but there's no sign that the overall economy is at or near a recession. So I'm sorry that I can't hear you. I'll try to figure out why that's the case after our class is over. I just can't imagine why. I have nothing muted. So could somebody try talking to me now? I just pressed something to see if I could hear
Hello,
something.
Professor, can you hear me?
Somebody try speaking.
Can you hear us,
Professor?
Still nothing. Okay, I'm sorry.
Can you hear us, Professor?
Okay,
Clown.
new material.
Clown.
Let's get to work.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, thank you, but I can't hear anybody, and I don't know why. Okay,
He said,
so we've talked about growth, and I'll correct this problem by Wednesday. So let's see what we could do. Okay, so far the emphasis has been on economic growth. The first half hour of this class that we spent has focused a lot on that, on the kinds of things we've looked at. Now, in the previous class, we pointed out that economic growth is not free. You know, you have to do things to make your economy grow, like maybe pump up your money supply, etc. It's not free. But we also pointed out that it has side effects. The environmental effects of economic growth are well known, and in many ways they're fearsome. You know, we get pollution when we grow. We get a lot of waste when we grow. We get income disparity when we grow, where some people do very well, they welcome the growth, and other people get left behind. This is the nature of growth anywhere. It's not equal for everybody, and certainly not equal for all groups. So we know that economic growth has its side effects, but let's see if we can get underneath it, because if we're going to do our job in a macro class, we have to understand really what the determinants of growth are. Why is it that the US economy grows on average at a rate now somewhere, you know, just slightly below 3% a year, every year on average? Why is that? Why did China grow so much faster in the past 25 years than the Western industrial economies did? Or why Russia did, which has also a communist, a communist regime? Why is Venezuela a basket case? Why can't Cuba get its economy out of its own way? Yet the Philippines grows, Vietnam grows, India grows. Why is that? That's where we're going with this discussion. So economic growth is the expansion of a nation's capacity to produce goods and services by the various sectors. And what it involves is your productive capacity. And we're going to introduce now two terms that we will be using over and over and over again in this class. When we think about resources, think about resources in terms of their quantity and their quality. The most productive economies are those that have a lot of capital and a lot of labor, and it's of high quality. And one of the things we know about quality is that new is always better than old. So if you go to a dentist's office, your dentist today uses way more equipment than a dentist did 25 years ago. That's quantity. But the quality is so much better. You know, when I was a college student and somebody said they needed to go for a root canal, they knew that they were in for many, many days of a lot of pain in their mouth, or if they had to get their wisdom teeth extracted, you knew that that was going to be pain for a long time. No more, the quality is better. Think about it. If you go to your dentist, would you be more likely to want to go to a dentist using equipment that was installed in 2021, or dentist who had his or her equipment installed in 1981? I think the answer is pretty clear. The new equipment is always going to be better. The laptop that you have, or the desktop computer, or the iPad that you have, whatever, you know the new ones are always better than the old ones. They are. So that's a quality issue. We always are looking for new. You know, we're headed now toward 5G technology. It's going to make Wi-Fi totally obsolete. That's where we're going. So that's fine. But you got to have a quantity of it too. You got to have a lot of it. Because what good is it to have in your economy, to have the very best equipment, but only 2 companies have it? No, you want it to be disseminated all over your system. You know, one of the things that CUNY did, one of the things that the New York City Department of Education did for high school students and middle and elementary school students is say, if we're going remote, we've got to get equipment into the hands of our students. Just have to do it. So quantity matters also. So in your mindset, as this course continues, think in terms of quality and quantity. But that doesn't only apply to capital. It applies to labor. Those countries that have a lot of labor, but the labor is untrained, have a problem. But if you have a lot of really well-trained people in your labor force, they're well-trained, they're knowledgeable, they're skilled, and then on top of it, there's a lot of them, you have a real advantage. You know, one of the things that so much of the industrialized world is facing right now is that the only population growth that they get comes from immigration. In the United States, the birth rate and the death rate are almost identical. So in the United States, if the quantity of labor is going to go up, it has to happen through immigration. Because roughly for every person who is born in the US, somebody else passes away. Despite the fact that we have an advanced medical system, and despite the fact that life expectancy in the US has gone up dramatically, even though it's actually lower here than in many other parts of the world. One of the big issues going forward is exactly that. Even China, with 1.4 billion people, by far the biggest population in the world, there's an issue of population growth. That population growth has really slowed dramatically. That's true in so many countries in the world. And so what happens is that the median age of the population keeps getting older and older. And as the population gets older and older, you get more and more people who become senior citizens, and then they become more dependent on the government. And then the government has to get bigger, and it has to be financed for, like in this country, for Medicare, for example, and Social Security. All of these issues are very, very real. So we see with labor, yes, we want more people. Yes, we want them to be better trained with a better skill set. And of course, more knowledge. And as you know, I've said this before, knowledge to me is far less important than skills. So that's where we're headed. We're thinking about the nature of economic growth. Think about the quantity and quality of labor and the quantity and quality of capital. So when we think about real GDP growth per capita, which is really what you're shooting for, more output, more income per person means that on average people are doing better. You're really looking at, you know, a mathematical truism of more hours per worker, more workers in the population. Excuse me one second, I have to wipe my eyes. I'm sorry about that. So what you're looking at, more output per hour, which is productivity, more hours per worker, and more workers as a share of the population, which is just another way of saying you want more productivity, that's more output per hour. You want the length of the work week, which is a measure of effort, to grow, which is more hours per worker, which is reported every single time we get a report. And as you know, I asked you to look at the labor report that came out on Friday. Average length of the work week is one of the most important numbers. And then as a share of the population, how many of them are in the labor force? How many of them are actually out there looking for a job or fully employed? You want that to be growing. Okay? So as I pointed out to you, there's a difference between the destination, which is maximum economic growth, and the journey. How do you get there? What do you do? How do you improve the quantity and quality of your labor force? How do you improve the quantity and quality of your capital stock, for example? These are the things that we look at all the time. This is central to what explains economic growth around the world. So when we look at the drivers of growth, I ask you to pay your attention to the chart that's on the right side, and you look at the contributions to GDP growth, where you've got the light blue, which is the contribution of workers or labor, and the gray part, which is the contribution of capital. You can see it varies over time. There are times when it's labor that's driving real economic growth, and there are times when it's really capital that's driving real economic growth. But in order for there to be output, there has to be production, of course. And production could be a service, or it could be production of a good. Regardless of what it is, we have to create what we refer to as a production function. And a production function is just a combination of resources that we put together in order to produce something. Actually, all of you have been working with production functions your entire life. And as I pointed out, if you want to see the simplest example of a production function, it's a recipe. You're putting resources in, okay? Here are the vegetables you're going to use. Here's how you should cut them up. You know, you have carrots and you have celery and onions. You have other things that you put into your pan. Maybe you saute them in olive oil. Inputs. And you do that for 5 minutes. Because time is part of any production process, as you know. Chapters 4 and 5. A recipe is really the simplest of the production functions. Okay? It's this combination of resources and effort, but you need capital. You know, you need a stove, and probably you need gas in the stove or electricity in the stove, and you need pots and pans, and you need things to stir, maybe spoons, whatever. So a recipe is a kind of a production function, and everything they produce is in the form of a production function. And that production function typically is going to have 3 elements to it. It's going to have labor, it's going to have capital, it's going to have time. And then you have the resources that go into it. So some combination of labor, capital, and time will work together to use resources like broccoli or carrots or celery or onions, whatever it happens to be, to produce an output called a meal, or to produce an output called a Tesla automobile. It doesn't really matter, but you need all of them. You need capital, you need labor, you need time. When I visited Tesla's factory in Fremont, California, it's this sprawling factory. It is so clean that you could literally eat off the floor. The number of workers in that factory producing cars is amazingly few. Very, very few workers in there. You know, maybe a few dozen that I could see. And they all had very specialized jobs because the work was being done robotically. The robots were everywhere, and the robots were working automatically, taking, in many cases, just flat pieces of aluminum or whatever it was, automatically taking it, putting it in a spot. Some other thing comes down, it bends it, it forms a shape. Some other robot comes and takes it and carries it to another part of the factory floor where somebody directs the robot to put it together, and the next thing you know, you have a door for the car. So the point here being, when we look at production functions and we look at it in terms of these combinations of labor, time, capital, and time, taking resources to produce something, this is really what we're looking at. Well, the final bullet point says countries that persistently produce at a higher level than their potential tend to have upward inflationary biases? Well, there's a couple of things that are built into this statement. You remember I said, in order to do well in this course, deep down in your bones, in your heart, you need to understand the production possibilities curve from your first economics class. Think about the term production possibilities curve. It's the curve that tells you the combinations of output that are possible if you are working at full capacity, maximum efficiency, no waste, using best known production techniques. This is the best you can do. It makes no value judgment as to whether or not of the two things on the two-dimensional curve, you have more of this and less than that. No, it's just saying these are the possible combinations of output 1 and output 2. All of them are possible. And it's entirely possible that you could do all of output 1 and no of output 2, all of output 2 and none of output 1. That would be possible. Or you could have some of output 1 and some of output 2. Maybe you want a little bit more of output 2 and a little bit less of output 1. But those are the possible combinations. That is your potential production possibilities curve. That's your potential output. Now what we do is we measure the potential output, say, of the United States. And we see potential as being that which is sustainable. We can get there so it is sustainable. So sometimes the terms are used interchangeably, potential and sustainable. And what does that consist of? We say that potential output in the United States or any other country is the summation of its rate of growth of productivity, or the rate of growth of its output per hour of work, plus the rate of growth of the labor force. The rate of growth of output plus the rate of growth of the labor force gives you your potential or your sustainable level of output. That's what you should be able to do if you are operating at full capacity. Now comes the contradiction, which is in the final bullet point. Say, well, if that's your maximum, how could you possibly produce more than that? Well, that's where the word sustainable comes into play. You say, given the way things are right now, that is what is the maximum sustainable level of output. But things change. What could change? Maybe the government pumps tons of money into the economy. It changes. And so there's more money out there, more people are spending, and somehow businesses say, you know what? I got to find a way to become more efficient because I got to produce more because people are willing to spend all this money that's out there and I want to take advantage of it. I want some of that. But when that occurs, when an economy on a persistent basis gets a level of demand and therefore a level of output that goes above the growth of productivity plus the growth of the labor force, you have too much demand relative to supply because that's what productivity gives you. It gives you supply. You end up with inflation. And that is something we watch very carefully. We're always looking to see, is actual growth in the GDP on a persistent basis more than, equal to, or less than the summation of productivity growth plus growth in the labor force. And if that is the case, if the economy persistently seems to be growing faster than those two things combined, productivity growth, growth in the labor force, we say, uh-oh, that is potentially inflationary. Ladies and gentlemen, that is exactly what the financial markets are telling us right now. The financial markets are saying that actual GDP growth is faster than the sustainable growth rate, and we think inflation is coming down the road, and we need to build that into our expectations for the economy and for financial assets. That's exactly where we are right now. I'll stop right here and ask if you have any questions about any of these concepts.
You can't hear us.
No, I can't hear you.
Yeah, no.
I don't know why. I don't know what's happened.
Man, that was perfect.
So somebody asked whether or not the rapid growth in the money supply is potentially inflationary. We will talk about that in great length as this course goes on, but the short answer to the question is yes, it is potentially inflationary. Why hasn't it generated inflation? Why is the Fed still trying to get the inflation rate up to 2%? Why isn't it blown right through that with all the money that's been created? Answer: the money isn't being spent. If I put money into your pocket, but you don't spend it, there's no incentive for a store or a restaurant or a lawyer or an accountant or your barber shop or your beauty salon to raise their prices. Demand is going to look weak. So as long as we've got a situation where the money is out there, but it isn't turning over, it's not spending, you're not going to get inflation. You will get inflation when people go back into the stores, when people go back online and they start buying like crazy. That hasn't happened yet. There are positive signs that it might be, but it still hasn't happened. Is that something that the Fed hasn't had anticipated? Yeah, they were banking on it. Now, what they were banking on, no pun intended, what they were banking on is that some more of that money would be spent than actually has. I don't think they anticipated a 16% savings rate, but they knew that it would be up there. Because effectively what's happened is that the money that's gone out there has gone to people who are of relatively higher earnings. And those people have a higher propensity to save. And so the unintended but anticipated consequence has been that the money's gone into the stock market. Now, that may not be a bad thing. If you are somebody who has stock investments, maybe you own shares of a particular company or you own mutual funds, it's great for you. You know, if you're fortunate enough to have money beyond what you need to live on, it's great for you. Your investments have gone up in value. So yes, it was not anticipated, except to the degree that it occurred. And the it that I'm talking about is the high savings rate. I think the Fed would have liked more of it to be spent and less of it to have gone into the financial markets. But hey, you know, a lot of people have done very well. And again, it's kind of silent. You might be a New York City school teacher, in which case you might have annuities and you may have investments through the teacher's retirement system. So yeah, you don't get the highest salary in the world as a New York City school teacher, but your investments might be doing very well because you chose to put some money into, you know, your teacher's retirement system. So it wasn't desired. They're trying to make the economy grow faster. And it wasn't entirely unanticipated that some money would go into the stock market. I think they wanted less of it to go into the stock market, more of it to go into the economy. But I'll also end with this. If that occurred, then they might have gotten to their inflation number a lot faster, which is really what their goal was. So this is how it works. Okay. How is the house market right now? Are people buying more? As I pointed out to you at the beginning of the class, just real quickly, the housing market is very strong, but it's especially strong for new home purchases because that's where the action is. Houses are being built as fast as home builders can find carpenters and brick masons and plumbers and, you know, people who do roofing to do it. There's a shortage of workers, and new houses are being built and bought. The reason why the market for existing homes, like some home that might have been built 30 years ago, someone's living in it, now they put it on the market for sale. The only reason why that market has been sluggish is that people are not selling. They're not putting houses on the market for sale. There's a shortage of supply. So think about that. The question is, how's the housing market doing? Well, if you want to measure it by house prices, those prices are soaring because there's very little supply. There continues to be demand, especially at very low mortgage rates, but those houses are non-existing on the market. And so the prices go up. If you want to buy an existing home, you're going to have to pay a premium for it because there's very little supply in the market. Now, one of the things that's happened literally around the world, especially in the industrialized countries of the world, has been that productivity growth has been languishing. Now remember, this is output per hour of work. It's a ratio, and you always have to think of productivity as a numerator and a denominator. Well, one of the things that's happened is, as the economy has bounced back from its decline in March, April, May, June, we've put a lot of people back to work. That's the denominator of the fraction. So you make a denominator bigger, the fraction gets smaller, right? 2 over 3 is a bigger number than 2 over 7, right? So we've put a lot of people back to work, and that has had an impact on productivity. But that doesn't really answer the question. As why has productivity slowed, say, over the past 50 years or so? The slowdown in U.S. productivity actually can be timed. It actually started in 1973. We know that that occurred. But what's going on here, and some of it you may find surprising, maybe some of it you'll find interesting. More and more of output, which is the numerator of the fraction, is being produced outside the United States. So much more of our output is being produced abroad. You know that to be the case. The whole essence of many of former President Trump's messages is that he wanted to bring U.S. businesses back to the U.S., in part by reducing taxes on businesses so they have an incentive to come back and produce here. But I heard on the radio this morning that Chrysler Corporation makes its trucks and SUVs in Windsor, Ontario, Canada. Well, guess what? They can't get a lot of the parts that they need, like computer chips. And so they're shutting down temporarily some of the plant in Windsor, Ontario, until they could get their computer chips. A little thing like that, which costs a fraction of a penny to make. There's no supply. The growth in the demand for those is such that they just can't get them. But my point is, think about it. Chrysler, which is an American company, is producing their trucks in Canada. When they bring those trucks into the US for you to buy, that's considered a US import. So even though it came from a Chrysler facility in Ontario, Canada, once it crosses the border, comes north to south, it crosses the border, becomes a US import, even though it's a Chrysler product. But that said, more and more of what we produce is being produced outside the US. When you get undressed, at some point today, take a look at the labels in your clothes. Where was it produced? Where was it manufactured? Probably not here. So more and more is produced outside the US. That shaves away some of the output from here. That's in the numerator of the fraction. Shrink a numerator, the fraction gets smaller. Next, more output purchased within the US is produced outside the US by non-US businesses. So I talked about Chrysler producing outside the US. But what about stuff that you purchase that wasn't a US company? It didn't come from a US company. So pick a simple item. You go to your local food store or bodega or supermarket and you go to buy grapes. Those grapes are probably coming from Chile. Again, can we produce grapes in the United States? Yeah, we can. But if the Chilean grapes are better, and if the Chilean grapes are cheaper, we're going to bring them in from Chile. Simple. Demographics play a major role. Look at the age distribution of workers, the educational and training depth of workers, the phase of the business cycle we're in, the language proficiency of workers. Ladies and gentlemen, demographics matter. Look, Well, I'll play this out for you because it's something we're dealing with now. I guarantee that if my son was sitting here, and specifically my son-in-law was sitting here, he'd say, "Oh, all you got to do is just push this button and you'll be able to hear your students again." But I'm not as technologically savvy as my children are, and certainly my son-in-law. They're very comfortable with it. I see my granddaughter, who isn't even 2 years old. She probably has more technical facility than I do. Well, the point is that the demographics is such that we have a very large number of older workers who just don't have the technological sophistication of your generation. So that's one thing. We know that we have had shortages of workers. And if we have shortages of workers, in order to fill necessary spots, you hire workers who may not necessarily be as fully skilled as you want them to be. They're going to be less productive going forward. We know that all the population growth in the United States is coming from immigrants. A lot of immigrants don't speak English at all or don't speak it well. And so it impairs to some extent, depending on their occupation, some of their productivity. So we know that demographics matter. Technological changes are also responsible for reducing productivity. Remember, it's a fraction, output over income. Well, think about this. Once upon a time, when you took a picture or wanted to, you had to buy a camera. Well, a camera is also a bunch of components. So first, Canon or whatever the company is had to buy the components. They had to build the camera. They had to sell you the camera. And when they sold you the camera, that went into GDP. That was considered output. Oh, but then you needed film. You bought film. Oh, you used the film? You used to send it to a place to have the film processed. Oh, and then they would mail it back to you in an envelope. The envelope had to be made. Oh, postage to mail it back to you. Look at all the things that were involved there. Now, you go to take pictures, you pick up your phone. You make as many pictures as you want. Some you like, some you don't. The ones you like, you keep on your phone. The ones you don't, you delete into the garbage. You know what it costs you? Nothing. There was no output. You didn't have to buy a camera. You didn't have to buy film. You didn't have to pay for film processing. And then you took that photo that was on your phone and you moved it into some electronic photo album that's sitting in your living room or with Alexa or somewhere else. And you look at all of that and it's permanent and it never gets corrupted and it costs you nothing. And if it costs you nothing, it didn't get into the GDP. The numerator of the fraction is shrunken. But you know what? We're also better at a lot of other things. We have dematerialized. That means we're using less film and we're using fewer cameras, true. But you know what? We have also figured out how to produce things more precisely. You go into a factory now and let's say they're cutting metal. They only cut it once. They never make a mistake. There's never anything that gets scrapped because it came out badly. The robot did it perfectly, so there's less waste. And if there's less waste, you order fewer materials. And if you order fewer materials, the numerator of the productivity fraction is going to be smaller. And we're figuring out how to do things with less packaging or to make packaging that's totally recyclable. Think about that for a moment. All of these things are playing together to tell you that the numerator of the fraction has some things that's impairing economic growth. And yet you look at it and we're better off. Yes, less waste is better for us. It is. Having the ability to digitalize our photographs is better for us. We get better photos and we get more of them and we get more satisfaction. I mean, in the old days when you had a camera and you had a roll of film there, you could take 24 photos and then you waited for them to come back and you looked at them and you go, ugh, that's a lousy picture. I meant to take a picture of my cousin and I ended up only getting his feet, and you get lousy pictures and you throw them away. Well, if you do that with your cameras, with the camera in your phone, you just delete it. So the point here is, part of the reason why productivity growth has slowed has not been because anything is wrong. It's been because a lot of things have gone right. Like the fact that we've digitalized and we have dematerialized and we have more exact production processes with less waste, etc. The concept of total factor productivity is an important one because it makes a very important point. Total factor productivity refers to output per unit of capital over labor. What does that mean? Again, you have a fraction, numerator, output. Denominator, the ratio of capital to labor. So here's the idea. Having more capital per worker is going to be consistent with productivity growth. There was a time when if you went to a farm, you had a lot of workers who may have been in the field picking the output. Maybe it was a fruit or a vegetable or cotton or whatever you were growing. Now we recognize that the more capital we put onto the farm per worker, the more productive we're going to be. You know, when you have very sophisticated farm equipment and you have more of it per worker, you're going to be more efficient. And so we're able to produce way more farm output now on less land than we ever did before. So you're looking at a fraction of output, a fraction where the numerator is output relative to the amount of capital we have in the hands of workers. Flip it around. Suppose you have output over labor, but the labor has no capital. It's not going to be very efficient. You're not going to be very productive. So again, one of the things you want to take out of the class today is that the capital to labor ratio is very, very important. One of the things that accounts for why some countries have suddenly come out of nowhere to create really world-class economies is that they've gotten more capital into the hands of each worker. Look at the amount of capital that you use. Think about it for a minute. Capital, your laptop. Capital, your phone. Capital, your iPad. All of these things are part and parcel of how you generate productivity in education. And you have more of it than people had before. Think of it this way. Look at the capital I'm using. I'm using a laptop right now, but I'm also using intangible capital, software like PowerPoint, or just the software in Blackboard. It's an intangible form of capital. Compare that to being in the classroom where I'm standing in front of you with a blackboard and a piece of chalk. Where's the education going to be better? Those of you who have asked if I'm recording this class, I assume it's because you're going to go back and listen to the recording. Taking notes during class is really hard. You might go back into the recording, go to this topic of total productivity, factor productivity, and say, you know, when Malin went over that, I didn't understand any of what he was talking about. Let me go listen to it again. You'll go back, you'll listen to it. Maybe you still don't get it, so you'll go back and listen again. And then you'll get that aha moment. You go, oh, now I see what he's talking about. Of course, the capital to labor ratio. You want more capital per unit of labor to be generating output. Okay, that makes sense to me. And you went back and you listened, but that's the quality of the capital. The fact that you can go back and listen over and over again. So this will be the last thing that we will touch today. Total factor productivity depends on all of the things that you see here. It's a laundry list. Let me just emphasize only one point because the rest of them I think is pretty obvious. Right in the middle it says the strength of the supply chains. Supply chains matter a lot because we're talking about capital and labor. And I already mentioned to you that Chrysler Corporation is having trouble with its supply chain. Part of its supply chain is its connection to companies that give them little chips, the chip makers. And those chip makers might be in Taiwan, they might be in Hong Kong, They might be in Silicon Valley. Why do we call it Silicon Valley? Because the chips are made out of silicon. Where do they get the silicon from? They get it from sand, actually. So you get the sand. From the sand, you get silicon. From silicon, you're able to make chips. It doesn't matter where they're getting it from. They need a constant flow. If that flow gets disrupted for whatever reason, because you don't have a transportation network that's functioning, because a factory is closed because its workers got the COVID virus and they had to shut down, because airplanes are not crossing from one country to another, again, because of the virus, because maybe demand has been so strong that they've run out of it. We've talked about supply chains with the Moderna virus and with the Moderna vaccine, with the Pfizer vaccine. These are all supply chain issues. So having that supply chain becomes critical, because if you don't get it, it's very, very hard to get the capital that you need relative to labor. And we know that higher capital labor ratios are synonymous with having real economic growth, which comes from productivity. And so if you want to raise your sustainable or your potential growth rate in your economy, you must raise your productivity. And to do that, you have to have well-functioning supply chains. So I'll stop there. I will again apologize to you for my inability to hear you. I don't really understand why that happened. I can't explain it, but I'll work on it this afternoon so that we don't face this again on Wednesday. No, my laptop's not connected to Bluetooth. That's it. So we've gone over the first set of homework. We'll look at the homework related to this particular topic that we're working on now, which is productivity and growth models. We'll work on the solo growth model on Wednesday. I think you'll find that interesting if you haven't seen it. But the stuff that we've done today really uses a lot of the same concepts that Solo built into his growth model. I'll just end it with this. Robert Solow got a Nobel Prize in economics largely for this growth model. It is taught in every university where macroeconomics is taught everywhere in the world. It is the standard. It is a basic concept in macroeconomics that everyone looks at. And so whether I was on the West Coast at the University of Southern California, or dead center at University, or at the Army War College, or at Binghamton University, or Columbia and Barnard right down the street from CCNY, talk about the growth models. So it's really important, and it comes up really early. It's right here in the second main topic of the semester. But it's there because it lays the foundation for the rest of the course. So I would appreciate it if you would read about this stuff, read chapters 4 and 5, look at the homework questions. Some of you have already submitted homework on this, and I'm grateful for it. In a couple of cases, the answers you gave were very intelligent, really quite outstanding. Take a look at it, do the best you can, and we'll reconvene on Wednesday. Okay? Thanks, everybody. Be well, be happy,
I have a question
and
for
keep a
Brad.
smile on your face. And I hope you enjoyed the Super Bowl as much as I did.
You can't hear us.
They can't.
Yep, he's gone. He's the first one to leave.
Yo, where do we submit the homework?
Email it to him. Email it to him.
Oh, all right. No doubt. Thank you.
It's on the syllabus.
All right. Thank you.
You're welcome. The session's still going, it's recording. Oh well.